Welcome, everyone, to today's Target Ed. This is Identify and Cultivate Meaningful Partnerships. My name is David Gates, and I'm the Director of Online Education here at GrantStation, and I'll be your host. And your presenter today is Alice Ruhnke. Alice is the president of GrantStation, and over her career, she has raised over $45 million from federal, state, and private grant makers. And today, she's going to talk about an essential part of your funding strategy, partnerships. So please welcome Alice Ruhnke.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm so happy that you're here. Like David said, we have a busy 30 minutes or so agenda, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. But I do realize that some of you might be kind of wanting to hop off a little early and go take a look at the eclipse. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is kind of just start with the basics, like we always do, about how we kind of define and set up partnerships and how they're sort of like there's a lack of consistency and some definitions and things like that. So we're going to kind of talk through a little bit of that muddle that's there. And then look at partnerships as being like on a continuum of engagement. And we won't necessarily have to worry quite as much about separate definitions if we kind of look at it on a continuum of from least engagement to higher engagement and what those models entail in order to develop them and maintain them and manage them and all those sorts of things. So I know that partnerships are very valuable to us in the nonprofit community. I also know that they're not necessarily the easiest things in the world to either develop or especially maintain. So that's where I really wanted to spend the time today, really talking about those different components. So we'll just start very basically about kind of why do we partner? Why should we partner? And because quite simply, we're better together. When we are sharing those scarce resources and bringing the best of ourselves and our organizations to the cause that we're dealing with, working collaboratively really helps us to do the work that we're trying to do and have the impact on our missions more effectively. So there's a lot of different ways that we benefit from doing partnerships and really working collaboratively. If it's increasing efficiencies in how we provide those services or how people navigate through a system of care, that partnerships and collaborations really help with that. They help us expand our reach to new populations by having other organizations help advertise for us and make those soft handoffs to our organizations. And then just sharing our own knowledge and expertise and bringing again the best of us to the process and teaching others and helping others grow in their own professions and their own work. And then just having that greater impact because we're doing things collectively, we have a better chance to have a greater impact on those root causes of the problems that exist in whatever service area that you're working in. And so it just really helps our overall credibility as an organization and helps us really provide the services, get the services that people need to them in the easiest and best ways. So there's lots of good benefits to partnering, and probably one of the reasons you're here is because funders like to see those partnerships, right? And the reason that they do is so that we're sharing those resources and not everyone's not duplicating the same things over and over again in our communities. So it's important from the aspect of getting funding. But beyond that, it's also just a great idea to help us with all of the things on this slide to be the most effective and efficient and credible in our fields. So there's lots of good reasons that we want to do this beyond just for funding. So let's a little bit about definitions as we get started in what's a partnership. So you're going to see all these words on this slide. Somebody's going to say, here's, a coalition of people, here's an alliance of people, here's a consortium, here's, an association. And it's kind of like, What's the definition of all of those things? And the thing is there really isn't one set definition that different funders will call these things. One funder is going to call it a coalition, and another funder is going to call it a collaborative. And so, as you're looking at those definitions, you really want to provide the word that the funder is using to describe what you're creating. So here's just an example on this slide from a grant that a HRSA grant, the Health Resources and Services Administration, that I wrote for one time. And as part of applying for this grant, they wanted a broad multi-sectoral consortium, is what they called it. And HRSA, for the purpose of this grant, which is the rural development with neonatal abstinence syndrome, um, they're defining a consortium as 4 or more separately owned entities, including the applicant organization, with established working relationships and a history of collaborating to address substance use disorder or opioid use disorder. So again, here you can see this is just the way one organization is defining consortium. Another funder or federal agency could have the same thing on this page and ask for the same elements, but they could call it a collaborative. So really with the definitions, there's just not a set definition. And so you want to work with the funder on that. The way I like to think of it is there being that spectrum or that continuum with from the least amount of engagement over here on the left over to the largest amount of engagement over on the right. So, um, and again, on the left, your relationships are the least formal and dedicated. Again, to the right, it gets a lot more in detail and a lot more um, kind of intense in how you have to develop that and manage that and those sorts of things. So let's just talk through this a little bit. With associations, coalitions, and collaboratives, again, what I'm saying is that those terms all being interchangeable. And an example of a group working like this was I worked with a harm reduction coalition, they called it. And it was here in West Virginia, and it was all those programs and all the different counties working collaboratively to develop harm reduction programs and policies in their own communities. And so those groups, they support each other, they meet together, they help develop new programs and things like that, but they're all still working rather independently, right? So the different organizations within the coalition were all doing their own work, but they were sharing that information. They were sharing their policies and their procedures and their problems and the struggles that they've had and what's worked and that sort of thing. And so that, is a loose group, but working together kind of for a same overall common purpose in an area. A joint program would be where 2 or more organizations apply together to support an area. And so I've done a lot of joint programs where 2 organizations or more, 3 or 4, are working together to submit an application, and they're each going to take their individual piece of what they're doing and provide their level of expertise to the project. And so they're bound by that grant application to do the work that they're doing, but they're still independent organizations. So an example of this was just it was a Second Chance Act Department of Justice initiative of helping people after they get out of the criminal justice system. And so one group was providing, they were the mental health counselors, providing all of that support. That was half of the grant. The other half was this nonprofit organization who provided a fatherhood initiative with job training and all that kind of thing. And so collectively, as a group, they submitted an application to implement this project jointly. So they had, the shared goals for the grant and things like that. There's other ways to increase those efficiencies of just shared support functions among organizations. So it could be shared space that a number of nonprofits are, working together in the same space and sharing the costs and all the overhead costs that go on with that. I think, right now with the way people kind of have gone back to work or haven't gone back to work, that there's a lot more office space out there. So this could also be an opportunity at this time for people who, want to have their model be hybrid. You could combine with that organization and share the cost of that rent or those desks or those computers or those telephone systems that are all sitting there when people aren't necessarily all in the office. Other shared support functions can be where you work again with several agencies, and let's say you support one administrative person to direct all the traffic and the mail and the incoming information and the calls, or maybe you share the cost of a bookkeeper or an IT person or something like that so that you can get the person on board more full time and you can share the costs of that person with another organization. So that's again another great opportunity to reduce those costs, those overhead costs that we have in our organizations and share some of that with other organizations. And then finally, like the highest level of integration on these models would be a merger, where organizations are, take the best of their organizations and combine to create something new. And I've been a part of that. And that, again, is a very challenging situation, but it was a part of two organizations that were being funded by the same funder. And they wanted to kind of streamline that process and again take the best of what both of those organizations were doing and combine them into one new organization so they weren't sponsoring again all the overhead costs on two programs. All of a sudden it's just one overall cost for an organization. So as we move across this continuum, there's lots of things that we need to think about and how we set these things up. Again, with on the left, the least amount, the right, the most amount that we need to really consider. So just a couple of other kind of ways that we can collaborate just in case these are new ideas for you. There's always just the cross promotion. There's a lot of organizations that get together and just share information about what they're doing locally in the community and then being able then to network people into whatever program that they need. There's a lot of great ways to share reports and benchmarking studies and things like that. At GrantStation, we work with a lot of different partners to do that. We're on the for-profit side, but we work with nonprofit agencies and other for-profit agencies to create this information that everybody in the sector can use. And so that's just a great way to again advance the process and share the resources of different organizations. It could also just be combining together for conferences or training your staff and those sorts of things to not have to pay that twice. And again, before the pandemic, especially, I was really seeing this trend, especially in the conferences, of groups starting to combine their conference into one larger conference sort of thing. So that again just saves that efficiency and increases the collaboration that goes on. And then again, just coordinating of different program service delivery. And I imagine in about every sector that you're in the nonprofit sector, you're probably hearing more things about things like navigators and people that are kind of designed to really help people through the process because it gets so confusing. So a lot of those kinds of roles are in response to reducing those silos and figuring out how to work people through the system so that they can move from, wherever they start to wherever they want to be at the end. So there's lots of different great ways to collaborate. So how do we find those partners to collaborate with? So here's just one way is this partnership identification tool that I'm going to show you on the next slides. And looking through that and being really brainstorming different ways that you could partner with these different organizations. And as you're brainstorming those potential partnerships and the ways you can work together, I always want you to think of what is their motivation or self-interest in the process so that when you're approaching that partner, you're already identifying the reason that they might want to participate, what you're bringing to the table to support their efforts. Right? So putting it from a real strength-based perspective, you're not just asking them for contributions, which is the last component, but you're also going to be saying to them, "We have things to support you, and then we're looking for these possible contributions from you." So that it's a give and take, which is the best way to develop those partnerships where it's a win-win for everyone. So the tool is very, very simple. It just starts by breaking down businesses and corporations and different types of businesses and corporations and ways that you can identify those folks. And then looking again, why would they be motivated to support you? Usually in a business situation, they're looking for that exposure. They're looking for new customers. They're looking to be seen as good citizens. And so going to them with ideas of how you're going to provide that exposure to them is a really, great way to think about it. And then start thinking of those potential resources. We're probably always thinking of money, correct? But there's other ways that we can look for that support and collaborations, and it doesn't always have to just be money. It can be in-kind contributions of things that you use. It can be volunteer support of uh, their employees supporting you. It can be space or resources that you need that a company could provide to you. So kind of again thinking real, broadly into what your ask is from them, and again understanding what their motivations are. Now, this webinar is the first in our series of partnerships. We have 5 more after this about partnering with different groups. So the next time we're going to talk more about partnering with businesses and the models that are out there. We have more that I'll share with you at the end of different partnerships that we're trying to kind of teach how to work with these different kind of constituents. So then I have like a broad category here of community assets, where it could be lots of the social service agencies that work in the area. You've got schools from K through 12 through college. You have communities of faith, which is another one of our in our series here of how we can partner with them. Looking at government entities and how to partner, and then we just have a lot of different public resources that quite often we don't think about necessarily, that, media outlets, how can they help my organization get my story out? Or public resources in using the streams and the mountains and the physical resources you have in your community, your parks, different things like that that you can use. Um, that again, they would have a motivation to help you and connect with you, and could also probably provide you with those resources. So the first step is to first figure out who you want to partner with, right? Looking at their motivations and what you're kind of going to ask them for. And then again, as we go through the series, this entire quarter, will break down what's the best way to work with businesses, what's the best way to work with uh, communities of faith, those kinds of things. So when we're integrating, we've developed partnerships, we've figured out what that win-win is between us and this organization that we're bringing into the mix. The basics of what you really want to make sure that you are including in every proposal is the name of that organization that you're partnering with, and then what they are bringing to the table specifically. So what they're contributing to that project, and what their responsibilities are. As you go up the food chain, if you will, or up into higher levels of partnerships, then you might be actually connecting on an organizational level. And so potentially showing an organization chart of how your two organizations are reporting or developing initiatives together, what your communication plan is, how often you're connecting, what's the method by which you're connecting. Is it personal meetings once a year? Is it quarterly meetings over Zoom? Is it just as needed on Slack or some other system? How are you communicating with each other in the process? And then another big thing through writing grant proposals is that you're going to be reporting on outcome data and process data, what you do and what you achieve. And so again, the more integrated you are, then you're probably reporting on some of the same metrics or collecting the metrics together and reporting up to another agency. So what's that process look like of that reporting? Or how you kind of are setting up the meetings and your overall strategies. So, how are you making decisions? Is it majority rule? Is it consensus? How are you working through that process? So, again, at a minimum, you want to show who the organization is and what they're bringing. And then as you grow within that partnership or within that consortium or integrate more, then you're going to want to layer these things on to that process. And then at the end of this webinar, I have a bunch of resources about how to develop those memorandums of understanding or partnership agreements or MOAs, memorandums of agreement, whatever term it is that the funder is using that you need to create that contract, if you will, with the partner. And so I have a lot of resources at the very end about the nuts and bolts of developing those MOAs or MOUs. So I want to just give you guys just a second to kind of look this slide over and tell me which one of these two do you think scored higher in a grant application? And since I'm not going to read it to you, you guys can kind of read as we're going through. But hopefully, when looking at this, you automatically see the difference between these two paragraphs or sentences, right? Where the second one was definitely scored at a much higher level because as a funder, as a reviewer, I was able to see, okay, you've brought all these people to the table. I know exactly what they're going to contribute, if it's the land or the rain garden or the refreshments or whatever. I can really see that you have worked with other organizations and really decided, in particular, with specifics, what they're bringing to the table. A sentence like the very first one is so generic that it doesn't tell me anything as a reviewer. It just says to me, oh, I partner with everybody, which is a nice statement, but it doesn't mean anything unless there's something behind it. So unless you're really sharing with me what the Chamber of Commerce or that local government does, if you can't really give me specifics, then that statement just doesn't hold very much weight as a reviewer. So again, there can be a lot more detail that you're putting in these than just what these two paragraphs are, but you really want those specifics. And this is just a great example of really demonstrating those specifics. All right, why am I not advancing? There we go. All right. So as you're developing these partnerships, that the best way to develop partners is not to force the fit to start off with. That you really are looking for that win-win so that you're providing something to this organization, they're providing something to you, and that it's beneficial to both ends. Because if it's not, it might be okay for a little while, but it's not going to continue. People aren't going to give it the energy that it really needs if there isn't a win-win on both sides. So these things I think that you really want to develop well before you start writing an application, that you have to develop these partnerships and think through these ideas. And then when the grant opportunity arises, you're going to have this information already discussed, uh, kind of vetted, put through all the appropriate kind of steps and hoops that you might have to jump through, but it really you want to do this first, and get these relationships down and really realize that they take time, they take patience, they can go two step forwards and one step back. There can be conflict, those kinds of things. It's a process. It's not just a one time event, if you will. So they take some time to develop. And there's a lot of good things on this slide to really start to think through. Again, especially the more in depth you start to collaborate with people, of really defining who's going to do what and when. Again, in a harm reduction coalition, like I was talking about, they're all working independently. So there wasn't really any roles amongst the organizations. But the second one, the joint program, there was definitely roles that each person, one group was being the fiscal sponsor and they had to do this, and this group had to report in certain times and report back to this organization. And it was a back and forth. So they really had to flesh out those roles, flesh out how you're going to make decisions from the very beginning. That's one thing that you don't want is people to think, well, we're all going to work in a real, um, uh, by discerning each answer, and other people are saying, we're just going to go majority rule, then, there could be a lot of conflict that develops from that. What is that financial relationship? Is one organization paying another for anything or paying back another for something and that sort of thing? So the finances want to be really well defined as to who's doing what. The communication plan that I talked about a little bit ago of how often you're going to connect and what that looks like. Is it virtual, in person, written, oral, all those kinds of things. And then kind of what are those shared metrics? If you are indeed serving the same target population, are there some shared metrics that you're going to use to evaluate the success of the program? Are you sharing those goals? What's that planning process? How are you going to put these projects together? And then how are you going to resolve conflicts, which will occur no matter what, right? That's just the nature of it. So being aware of that up front and realizing that, even having that out from the very beginning is important. That if this isn't working for some reason, this is how we get out of this in a way that doesn't, harm the other organization and that sort of thing. So all of these things, again, there's no one answer, but there's lots of things to consider. And the more of a financial relationship you have, the more overlapping of your activities, the more you want these things predetermined in your process. And just managing the partnership once that you have developed it, again, the management comes from the very beginning, so you're really starting to figure out how to manage the relationship while you're actually forming the relationship. And then just also realizing that there's life cycles of partnerships, where at first you're starting to identify and recruit partners to come together, and your conversations may be way more open-ended and brainstorm type uh, formats, and really thinking through how you could both benefit. And as it develops, it's going to become more about then how do we onboard together? How do we actively engage together? And looking at some of those things from the last slide can really help you hone in on those things. Then how do you optimize the partnership after it's been operating and those sorts of things? So there's definitely a life cycle that usually starts with a little bit of a honeymoon period, and then will end up with some conflict that you're going to need to work through, and then to the operations stage. And then again, like I said, those MOA, that information is in the resources. So this is kind of the last thing that I want to talk about before we kind of finish up for today. But this has been a really, really important chart for me over the years, especially because I was quite often asked as a consultant to come in and work with a group. And again, it could have been an association of people working loosely together, all the way up to almost a merging type partnership. And very often, what happens when you get asked to come into a group, sometimes there's a reason for that. If you're being asked to facilitate it, it's usually because something's not working quite in the group, right? And so I was always really amazed that I would come into this group and something wouldn't be working and I couldn't figure it out. Nobody was articulating to me this problem or that problem, right? So this was always something that was really helpful for me of understanding of what the mood was, what the emotions are in the group. Are people really frustrated? Are people really nervous? Are people confused about what they're doing? And you can kind of see the different emotions over here on the right. And I really like this because it was like, for example, if there was a lot of distrust in the group, it could be because the communication was missing and that people weren't talking to each other and keeping each other with a good communication plan, keeping everybody updated of what was going on and how things were going and those kinds of things, which leads to distrust. I've also had lots of groups I've walked in with just the frustration. Everyone's kind of frustrated. Uh, Again, they can't really articulate exactly what it is, but they're frustrated. And so, again, looking at this chart, then you can look at a lot of times what that means is that there's not enough resources for people to do the work they're doing. And that can be why people are so frustrated. Or, you know, a group that's just very confused. I don't know why I'm here. Actually, I have worked in a group like that. I don't know why I'm here. What are we really doing with this group, et cetera, et cetera. And this was very true. It might have been a little bit on leadership, but between leadership and vision, it was just because it didn't have a mandate to move forward, right? So the group really didn't have this power behind it to move forward. And so everybody was very confused because there wasn't this clear kind of pathway, vision for the future with this group. So anyway, this has just been a really helpful tool for me as I'm working with change and trying to figure out where to invest energy in helping a group move forward when they're stuck. And hopefully, this will be something that you can use as well to help you work through some of those issues and then bring in the proper resource if it's leadership, vision, inclusiveness, action, skills, resources, incentives, or communication. So, how you can then figure out how to develop that. So, kind of just to wrap up, when you get the slides that they were sent out this morning, and then we'll also be sending them out later this week. But there's links to all these different resources as to how to develop that MOU, things that you need to consider when you're writing that, some of the language that you want to use in that. And there's just different types here from that MOU to collaboration toolkit, creating an MOU from Colorado. From the Contracts Council, they have an article about how you create memorandums of agreement. Again, you'll see here where it says this article defines a memorandum of agreement and what makes them different from a memorandum of understanding. I will also say this, I find that the words like MOU or MOA, I don't know that they're really different either. Some people say they're different, but then I can see the same things out there and I'm like, well, those are both MOAs, or this is an MOU and this is an MOA. I mean, you can just kind of see them and like they look the same to me, sort of situation, but that's just one of those places where the definitions get a little confusing. And then here's just another one from Up Council where you can actually download and customize it and use the template. So just another resource to help you in developing those. We're going to stop here for some questions in a minute, but I did want to just let you know that this was our first one, our free one in this quarter series of our target eds. And then we're going to take this quarter and we're going to look at best practices in partnering with businesses next. Then looking at working with other nonprofits and what are some best practices in that. Then looking at local governments and then financial institutions like banks and things like that. And then with communities of faith. So they all have a little different flavor to them, just depending on what you're looking for and those sorts of things. So there's nuances. So each target ed will talk about a different specific type of partnership and how you can develop those relationships. Um, so I think now what we'll do is see if there's any questions out there.
Perfect. Thank you, Alice. And as a reminder, if you do have any questions, you can jump over to the Q&A and enter them there. There was one question earlier in the chat. I'm just wondering, for a newer organization with maybe less to offer in terms of kind of what they're going to bring to the table, what type of partnerships do you think they should explore right away?
I think that working probably with other nonprofits would be the easiest one, just simply because nonprofits are a little more used to partnering without there being an exchange of money or necessarily a specific tangible resource. So I think those nonprofit partnerships will be the easiest to go out and start to cross promote the work you're doing, get other people to advertise for you, get them to send people to you, or vice versa. Potentially you have a group of people that you need to send out to people and that sort of thing. But I think the nonprofit partnerships would probably be the easiest one because there's a lot of examples of them out there. And then also they could just be that we just simply want to share information place. And nonprofits do come from that space a lot of just let's share information or resources or
Hmm.
ideas and those kinds of things.
Yep, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Then Kathleen said, we are often asked to go through our nonprofit as a pass-through to gain the funding. Where does this fit in an application?
We're often asked to go through our nonprofit as a pass through to gain funding. So I'm kind of assuming that what you mean is that your nonprofit is a fiscal agent or a fiscal sponsor for a project. And I'll just go on that first, that would be my assumption.
Yep, Kathleen said
Is that
yes.
okay? So your project fits under their umbrella. And so the nonprofit is applying for the funds, and their books are the ones that are going to be looked at or audited or put through whatever hoops have to be put through for that organization, and your project just fits with under it. So you're still going to, in your application, you're still going to talk about the benefits of that particular project. You're going to talk about the things that your project have done and the outcomes you've achieved and the work that you've done and those kinds of things. When you're looking at your organizational background, I think I would highlight both that this organization is serving as the fiscal agent and then putting the background of your particular project in there. But the applicant in those cases are the fiscal sponsor. Um, and then throughout the rest of the application, it really doesn't change anything. You're still going to have whatever need it is you're addressing and whatever you're going to achieve through your outcomes and your indicators. And your approach is still going to be how do you do it? The budget is still going to be what do you need to do the work that you're doing? So it really only comes into play in kind of that background information. And I think highlighting the fact that this organization is your fiscal sponsor has all of that capacity to manage the finances of your grant, and that you and the people working on your project have the ability to do that work. So yeah, that's a great question though.
Hmm. Yep, and then
Yep.
Kathleen kind of said, that makes sense. How do I help with the possible audit? Would they have anything to do with that?
So
Yeah.
yeah, you probably wouldn't. So the audit would be a requirement of that nonprofit organization. It's a little different in every state what the threshold is as to when you have to have an audit, but each state has its own bar for that. And so if your organization gets so much in revenue, then you have to have an audit, or you might be below that audit, right? You might not have to get it. So that's really more to the organization and their need for that based on everything they do beyond your one project. Um, but really that's more on the organization doing that. And what I've seen a lot of is nonprofits, even if it's not just a project, but a smaller nonprofit who doesn't have the audit and the audits required for submission, then where I see a lot of what happens is that the nonprofits then go to an organization that are big enough to have an audit, and then that organization is the fiscal sponsor, and then they are the applicant, and then the nonprofit still carries out all of its activities and all that sort of thing, but the lead organization, because it had to have that audit, is a bigger organization that has an audit.
Visit GrantStation to see our latest online education offerings in the form of live webinars, interactive workshops, and on-demand learning. GrantStation.com, your fast track to funding and online education.